Hi there, so I'm going to go through a demonstration of a pigeon pose, the pigeon stretch that you often see in yoga classes, or half pigeon I should actually say. It's with one leg rather than two. And you see this often in yoga classes. You see a lot of people who are very flexible, going very deep into this very quickly. And it's not about really going into the pose deeply so much as it is finding the engagement of the stretch that you're looking for on the front leg, the bent leg typically, and that's what we're going for here. And there's a few ways to dial into the stretch. If you're tight, it's still a valuable stretch to get into, even if you don't feel like the pose that you come into looks all that great or looks as impressive as somebody who has more range of motion. And the way you usually see people coming into this in yoga classes, they'll usually come in from down dog. Not necessary, but it's one way to sort of rev things up. So from here, from my downward facing dog, I'm going to stretch out my right hip. So I'm going to bring the right leg forward, right leg high. Now when I come forward, I'm bringing the knee forward behind the right wrist and then to the side, and then my right ankle is somewhere behind the left wrist. Now this doesn't have to be, you don't have to come with the shin parallel to the front of that. My shin is actually at an angle here, and that's okay. Bring the back knee down, flatten your back foot, and then just sink your hips down low. So you want to keep your hips squared as you're coming into this pose. So there's going to be a tendency to want to open up toward the front foot and let your hips open up. There's not much of a stretch there, keep in mind. And a lot of the stretch that we're looking for here that I'm going to talk about in this video is going to come from the outer hip of the front leg, moving into the glutes a little bit. Now to find that, you're going to have to keep the hips squared to the front. So I'm pulling my right hip back and pulling my left hip forward. And as my hips square, I'm just going to sink down. And now if your hips are still lifted, and keep in mind, my butt's still up off the floor. There's nothing wrong with that. All right, if you can hold tension here and not feel any twinge in the knee, you're doing just fine. And by holding tension, I'm talking about my front foot. I'm kicking that into the floor, and I'm using some muscle work here, some body tension to keep my hips squared and in place. And you can just stay like this. Now, if you can take it deeper, there's a whole thing of coming into back bends and lifting the back foot. And I'm not really going to talk about that too much. But if you want to settle in for a longer time, keep that tension, keep your hips squared, and then maybe come down to your forearms, and you can hold this shape here. The hips are still squared, and you will still want to feel that stretch. And to make this more effective, I'd kick that front foot into the floor, keep in mind. If you want to settle in all the way, and some people like to rest in this position and just let their body flatten out, you can take it here as well. And it's not really necessary, but it depends on how long a hold you want to take and how comfortable you are in this pose. If you're really tight, you're probably going to be up pretty high when you come into this. And if this feels like too much, or if it's too much to engage tension in the leg, and if you're not used to doing this kind of thing, it's hard, you can use a block. And then bring that underneath that front hip, or front glute, I should say, and you've got something to prop yourself up on. And you can just feel this out here. There's still a good amount of body activation. So I'm still pulling my left hip forward and the right hip back, and I'm trying to let myself sink down. And you may find that starting out here helps to let you settle into the pose, and then maybe after you hold this for like 30 seconds to a minute or a few breaths, maybe you can start to pull this out and sink a little bit further down. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. You always put it back. But just kind of feel things out as best you can and see how far you want to take this. And to really make the pose effective, I would work to probably try to hold this for a total of a minute at a time. You can do it in increments, maybe 2 minutes if you like. But really just kind of feel things out. And this is a good stretch to release a lot of tension in the outer hip, moving toward the low back and around the pelvis and around the base of the spine, and a little bit into your glutes. Now I'll show a couple other variations of this pose as well. All right, I'm going to show you a little modification for your half pigeon stretch. If you're having trouble getting into it in the usual way that you'd see in the yoga class, where you go into down dog, you bring that leg forward and the back leg straight behind, I'm going to emphasize the front leg, finding that stretch in the outer hip. There's a way to do this from all fours, and you're just finding that position where you can bring the shin basically crossing the line of your body. All right, so from here, I'm going to stay in basically kind of an all-four shape, and this is kind of all fours right here. But I'm going to bring my right leg forward here to start, and I've got a bolster here to elevate the leg a little bit, and just to make things soft, so I'm not pressing into the hard floor. That makes it a little bit easier once you start this out. So from here, I'm going to bring my right foot over to the left side, and you can just pull that leg in if you need to. Come to the outside edge of the foot, engage the foot, and curl the toes. Now, feel this out here, and you're going to have to start to move around a little bit to settle into this. And maybe the back knee goes back, but keep your hips squared forward. And from here, I'm going to let my hips come forward toward my foot and start to sink down. And you can just stay like this, keep in mind. And this moves you toward basically the variation that you take from that down dog shape that you usually see in a yoga class. Now, if you need to back off a little bit, you can bring your hands forward and then just sort of find that stretch. You can keep that back knee bent and just bring weight off and onto the leg. Now I'm kicking that foot into the bolster. I'm bringing my left hip forward so it's squared with the right, and I'm just finding the stretch. So I'm trying to pull the hips forward and sink the hips down at the same time. And so this is a good modification of the pose that you can kind of settle into here without it being too extreme, especially if the hip flex is tight and you have a lot of trouble having that leg really straightened out behind you. And you just kind of take this back and forth, moving in and out of this. And you may want to do this just to loosen up the outer hip. But again, keep the toes of that front foot engaged and keep kicking down. You don't want to feel any twinge in the knee that's forward. And just taking this from the other side. So I'm going to step this back, bring this back into all fours, and this time I'll take the opposite legs just so you can see it from that side. So this time I'm bringing my left foot forward in front, basically in front of my right hip. So I'm bringing that left foot in. I'm on the outside edge of the foot. I've got the toes curled. And with my hands on the bolster, I'm just feeling this out here. And you're going to move things around to switch a position. Now, my shin is not going to be perfectly in line with the bolster. It's going to be a little bit more diagonal, especially if I want to get deep into the outer hip. And if I'm going to start to sink this down, maybe I'll slide the knee back a little bit, and this is fine. You can take it from here, and this may be enough of a stretch. You can move around a little bit, but be sure when you're moving, you're taking it slow and keeping that foot engaged. The toes are still curled. I'm keeping the leg tense so that any sensation, any really stretch goes into the outer hip, and I'm not feeling this move across the knee. And that's the big warning here. If you feel any twinge in the knee, you need to back off from what you're doing. And you can always just hold like this. Now, if I'm going to take it to the version I was in before, finally, I'm going to bring my hands in front of the bolster. I'm still basically in all fours. And I'm just taking this back and forth, squaring up the hips, kicking into that foot, and just letting myself sink down. And if you can take it a little bit further, maybe sink down a little bit further still. You can move around in this, keep in mind. And you just want to see about finding that stretch in the outer hip as best you can. So this is another modification of this pose. All right, I got one more variation on the pigeon stretch here. And this is something that you can use as a modification as opposed to doing it on the floor, or you may just find that this is something just more convenient to do because a lot of times you got a couch nearby or you got a little countertop or a little shelf the way I do right here. And sometimes it's easier to go into this pose from standing and look for the stretch, and you're not bearing as much weight on that leg that you're working on to find the stretch in the hip. So I'm going to stretch out my right hip, which means I'm going to bring my foot onto the shelf. All right, so from here, you got to position your body out. Now, you got to feel things out, and there's nothing quite perfect here, but with that front leg, keep the toes curled, keep the foot tense. And then go ahead and bring your hands onto whatever surface you're going toward and start to move forward. Now, you can move into the hips a little bit, take this back and forth, but really start to feel that stretch. Now, I'm moving into my right hip, into the glutes a little bit, and I can feel this along basically the top of my butt. So moving in toward the sacrum here, the base of the spine. Now, once you find a position that works for you, just hold it and tense up. Pull the other hip forward, kick into that foot that's actually on that surface that's elevated, and you can move down and up. You can take it back and forth, or you can just hold still. And this is a good position to just feel a further stretch. Maybe even sink into this a little bit and start to come down, or even just take it back and forth. Now, if you're moving, go slow, and again, keep that foot tense. And if you want to see it on the other side, I'm going to do the same thing from here. And keep in mind, this is about maybe 2.5 feet up off the floor, so it's not too high. You can go higher if you're more open. So this time I'm going to bring my left foot up. And again, the toes are curled, the foot's active. I'm keeping the leg tense. You don't want to feel any twinge in the knee. You want the sensation to go toward the outer hip as much as possible. And then for me, I'm just feeling this out. I'm just taking this back and forth, and I'm turning toward that shin to find a deeper stretch into the outer hip. And then maybe even bring the hands further forward. And again, you can sink down and come up. You can go forward and back, but find the position where that stretch is. And this is going to be different for everybody. There's nothing perfect about this, keep in mind. Everybody's body shape is different, where the muscle tension is different. And so the cueing that you hear in yoga classes or from people who aren't working with you one-on-one is in generalities. And so you've got to sort of take the direction that they're talking toward and see where that applies to you. Once you find that stretch, you can just settle in. And again, just hold this for time. You can move around. But once you look into that, and once you've held that stretch for a little bit, go ahead and release it. And this is the kind of thing, if you come into it pretty frequently, try to hold it for like 30 seconds to a minute, do it most every day, and you'll start to get a little bit of relief in that area, basically outer hip, top of the glutes.